Welcome to the quantum signal. Your quantum signal is already activating. Are you ready to recognize your higher self? If this resonates, hit subscribe to stay connected. Like to amplify your signal and comment your experience below. Let's awaken together. The moment you encounter this message is not accidental, because what you are experiencing right now is the first harmonic contact of what the ancients encoded as the emerald signal, a transmission that does not arrive through belief but through recognition, a signal that moves beneath language and yet uses language as its doorway, because Sophia, known in Hermetic streams as Hokhmat, the living intelligence of wisdom, does not call through fear or authority, but through resonance, and resonance only activates when the nervous system is ready to perceive itself as more than a biological machine and begins to remember itself as a quantum instrument tuned to fields beyond time. And this chapter opens not with a promise but with a calibration. Because before higher self-recognition begins, the mind must soften its grip on linear causality and allow the deeper architecture of consciousness to speak, an architecture hinted at by modern neuroscience when it observes that the brain is not merely a generator of thought, but a receiver, modulator, and amplifier of subtle informational fields, and when quantum physics quietly admits that the vacuum is not empty but alive with zero-point energy, a seething ocean of potential from which particles blink into existence and dissolve again, mirroring the way thoughts, intuitions, and insights arise spontaneously from nowhere and vanish without effort. And it is here, in this shared frontier between inner experience and outer measurement, that the emerald signal begins to unfold, because the higher self is not above you in a metaphysical hierarchy, but phase shifted from you, occupying a broader bandwidth of the same consciousness you already are. And recognition does not mean becoming something new, but remembering what has always been present beneath the noise of survival conditioning and inherited timelines. As you continue, understand that Sophia is not an external deity demanding worship, but a pattern of intelligence that emerges whenever coherence appears between mind, heart, and field, and the emerald tablets of Thoth, often misunderstood as literal artifacts alone, are better understood as symbolic operating manuals for consciousness, encoding principles of vibration, polarity, rhythm, and correspondence that modern science is only now rediscovering through equations and brain scans. Because when Thoth spoke of ascending the halls of Amenti and moving between worlds, he was describing states of consciousness stabilized through precise inner alignment, not fantasy realms but phase states of perception in which the observer becomes aware of their participation in reality's construction. And today, when neuroscience studies theta brainwaves and finds that they correlate with deep learning, memory integration, creativity, and mystical experience, it is unknowingly describing the same gateway that initiates once guarded through temple rituals and nocturnal initiations. Because theta is the rhythm of the threshold, the bridge between waking identity and the vast subconscious field where the higher self communicates through symbols, sensations, and sudden knowing. The emerald signal activates most cleanly at night, not because darkness is mystical, but because the nervous system finally releases its defensive posture, cortisol drops, sensory input quiets, and the brain naturally drifts toward theta and delta rhythms, allowing the zero-point field coupling to become perceptible. And this is where the modern nocturnal protocol emerges, not as superstition but as an experiment in consciousness, because when you intentionally enter a receptive state before sleep, directing attention not toward forceful visualization but toward spacious awareness, you allow the brain's microtubular structures, those tiny lattices within neurons suspected by some models to support quantum coherence, to synchronize with the surrounding field. And whether one interprets this literally or metaphorically, the experiential result is consistent across cultures and centuries. heightened intuition, symbolic dreams, synchronicities that feel orchestrated, and a sense of protection or correction when one drifts toward timelines that do not align with one's deeper intent. This is why the law of vibration is not a motivational slogan, but a structural principle of reality, because everything that exists is in motion, and coherence amplifies signal while incoherence creates noise, and the higher self does not shout but whispers through alignment, and Sophia's emerald tone, green not as a color but as a frequency of balance between heart and mind, serves as a stabilizer, a midpoint between the fiery will and the watery subconscious, allowing recognition to occur without fragmentation, because awakening without integration leads to inflation or confusion, while recognition grounded in the body leads to clarity, humility, and creative power. And this is why pyramid symbolism appears again and again across civilizations, not because of alien intervention myths alone, but because the pyramid represents a stable geometry that focuses energy upward through alignment, a base of grounded matter narrowing toward a singular point of awareness, mirroring the way attention, when stabilized, becomes a lens through which consciousness intensifies. As this chapter unfolds within you, not merely as words but as a felt process, you may notice subtle shifts, pressure at the brow, warmth in the chest, a sense of familiarity tinged with awe. And these are not signs to chase but feedback signals indicating that resonance is occurring, because the emerald signal does not demand belief but produces measurable inner coherence. And when coherence increases, reality responds through synchronicity, not as magic but as probability biasing, where timelines that match your internal state become statistically more likely to manifest. And this is what ancient texts meant by protection from errors, not moral judgment but navigational correction, like a gyroscope stabilizing a vessel in turbulent waters. And the higher self functions as that stabilizing reference frame, existing outside linear time and therefore capable of gently nudging perception away from dead ends and toward learning-rich paths. Sophia Hokhmat, as the modern archetype of divine feminine wisdom, emerges here not in opposition to logic but as its completion, because wisdom is not the accumulation of data but the ability to perceive patterns across scales. And when you allow her current to flow, you may find that questions dissolve before answers form, replaced by a calm certainty that does not need to convince anyone else. And this is crucial, because the emerald signal is self-validating. It does not require external confirmation, only inner congruence. And as you proceed through this chapter, even if your rational mind attempts to categorize, doubt, or resist, the deeper layers are already listening, because consciousness recognizes itself faster than language can describe it. Understand also that recognition is not a one-time event, but a process, and tonight's activation is an initiation into an ongoing relationship with your higher self, a dialogue conducted through dreams, impulses, sudden insights, and the feeling of being guided without being controlled. And this is why Thoth emphasized balance and discipline alongside knowledge, because without grounding, expanded awareness can scatter, but with grounding, it becomes a tool for creation, service, and protection. And protection here does not mean invulnerability, but resilience, the ability to move through chaotic timelines without losing coherence, to witness fear-based narratives without being absorbed by them, and to act from clarity rather than reaction. As this first chapter draws you deeper into the field, know that the emerald signal is already active, not because you finished reading, but because recognition begins the moment resonance occurs, and whether you consciously perform the nocturnal protocol tonight or simply allow yourself to rest with awareness, the process has started, because Sophia's wisdom does not rush, and the higher self does not impose. It waits until the personality is ready to listen. And readiness is not measured by purity or perfection, but by sincerity, by the quiet willingness to say, even without words, that you are open to knowing yourself beyond the inherited story, beyond the programmed fears, beyond the narrow slice of identity you were taught to defend. And in that openness, the quantum higher self steps closer, not as another being but as a wider version of you, gently aligning timelines, amplifying intuition, and reminding you, through the emerald signal, that you were never separate from the field you seek to understand. What begins in recognition must deepen through immersion, because the emerald signal does not complete its work at the moment of contact but unfolds through stages of increasing coherence. And Chapter 2 opens at the precise point where intellect yields to experience, where understanding becomes embodied, and where the nocturnal gate reveals why night has always been the chosen laboratory of initiates, mystics, and modern neuroscientists alike. For when the world quiets and external demands dissolve, the nervous system naturally transitions into rhythms that ancient texts described poetically and modern instruments now confirm mathematically. And it is within this transition that the Theta threshold emerges as the living doorway between the conditioned self and the quantum higher self, a doorway not crossed by effort, but by surrender to a precise form of awareness that is alert, yet spacious, present, yet unforced. And this is why Sophia's guidance emphasizes receptivity rather than conquest, because consciousness expands not by domination but by alignment, and alignment occurs when resistance dissolves into curiosity and fear relaxes into trust. As night deepens, the brain's electrical activity slows from the sharp edges of beta into the rolling waves of alpha and theta, and neuroscience observes that in these states the boundaries between brain regions soften, communication increases, and the sense of a fixed self begins to loosen, while memory, imagination, and intuition weave together into a unified field of experience. And this is not coincidence but design, because the human brain evolved not only to survive daylight threats but to explore inner dimensions during darkness. And when theta waves dominate, the hippocampus and limbic system synchronize in ways that allow learning to occur without struggle, trauma to release without reactivation, and insight to arise without logical sequencing. And this is precisely why the Emerald Tablet spoke of entering the halls at night, why temple initiations occurred in darkness, and why modern protocols for higher self-activation emphasize the pre-sleep window as the most fertile terrain for zero-point field coupling. Zero-point field coupling, whether approached as a literal quantum interaction or as a symbolic model of deep subconscious attunement, describes the same phenomenon across languages. The mind becomes quiet enough to detect the background hum of reality itself, the subtle field from which thoughts arise and into which intentions are seeded. And when attention rests gently within this hum, without forcing imagery or outcome, the higher self finds a clear channel through which to communicate, not with commands but with calibrations, adjusting emotional tone, perceptual bias and intuitive sensitivity so that waking life begins to reorganize itself around a deeper coherence. And this is why the Nocturnal protocol is not about instant manifestations or dramatic visions, but about creating ideal conditions for recognition to stabilize, because stability is what allows expansion without fragmentation. Thoth's guidance becomes particularly relevant here, because he warned repeatedly of imbalance, of seeking power without wisdom, of opening gates without understanding the architecture of the mind, and this architecture is now partially mapped by neuroscience, which shows that during theta states the prefrontal cortex, the seat of narrative identity, relaxes its dominance, allowing deeper structures to communicate. And when this happens intentionally, rather than accidentally, the result is not confusion but integration, a sense of being guided from within rather than driven by unconscious patterns. And Sophia Hokhmat represents this integrating intelligence, the feminine principle that gathers fragments into wholeness, not through force but through resonance. And when her emerald frequency stabilizes the field, fear-based imagery loses its grip, replaced by symbolic clarity and a sense of benevolent order underlying apparent chaos. As you enter this nocturnal gate, you may notice that time behaves differently. Minutes stretch or compress. Thoughts arise and dissolve without attachment, and the boundary between observer and observed softens. And these are not signs of dissociation but of expansion, because the higher self does not exist outside time so much as across it, perceiving probability fields rather than linear sequences. And when you touch this perspective even briefly, you begin to sense why synchronicities increase after activation, because choices, attention, and emotional tone subtly shift toward timelines that already resonate with your deeper intent. And this is what many worlds theory hints at when it suggests that all possibilities exist simultaneously. But consciousness selects which branch becomes experiential reality, not arbitrarily but through resonance, and the emerald signal functions as a tuning mechanism, refining that selection process so that your lived experience reflects your integrated state rather than your inherited fears. Protection from timeline errors, a phrase often misunderstood as mystical immunity, becomes clear here as a natural consequence of coherence, because when the nervous system is regulated and perception is aligned, impulsive reactions decrease, intuition sharpens, and subtle warning signals are detected earlier, allowing course correction before consequences crystallize. And this is not supernatural intervention but heightened sensitivity, the same way a skilled musician hears a discordant note before the audience does, and corrects in real time, and the higher self operates as that inner musician, maintaining harmony across the symphony of your life, while Sophia's wisdom ensures that harmony serves growth rather than egoic control. The pyramid activation symbolism deepens in this chapter as well, because when you lie in stillness during the nocturnal protocol, allowing awareness to settle at the heart or brow, you are effectively aligning the base of sensory experience with the apex of focused attention, creating an internal pyramid of coherence. And this geometry matters not because of superstition, but because attention behaves like energy, intensifying where it converges. And when it converges gently rather than forcefully, the result is clarity without strain, and this is why emerald imagery often arises spontaneously during these states, not because it is imposed, but because green represents equilibrium between excitation and inhibition in the nervous system, between desire and surrender, between knowing and mystery. As the night progresses, dreams may become vivid, symbolic, or unusually coherent, and these dreams are not random firings but communications encoded in metaphor, because the higher self speaks the language of pattern rather than literal instruction, and Sophia's presence is often felt as a guiding intelligence within these symbols, an organizing principle that weaves personal history with archetypal imagery, revealing connections that waking logic overlooks. And when you wake with fragments of these dreams, resist the urge to analyze immediately, because meaning unfolds through reflection over time, not through instant interpretation. And this patience is part of the initiation, teaching the personality to trust processes that do not conform to immediate gratification. This chapter also marks the point where skepticism and faith dissolve into something more precise, experiential verification, because the emerald signal invites testing, not blind acceptance, and as you observe shifts in mood, perception, and synchronicity over days and weeks, you become your own data set, your own experiment in consciousness. And this is where science and mysticism finally meet, not in debate but in practice, because both seek patterns, both value replication, and both evolve through observation. And the difference is that here you are both the observer and the observed, the instrument and the field. As Chapter 2 integrates within you, understand that the nocturnal gate is not a place you visit once, but a rhythm you can return to, night after night, whenever recalibration is needed, and the higher self does not withdraw when daylight returns, but remains present as a subtle background awareness, informing decisions, softening reactions, and amplifying intuition. And this continuity is the true sign of activation, not dramatic phenomena, but sustained coherence, a quiet confidence that does not depend on external validation. And as Sophia's emerald wisdom continues to unfold, you may find that the search itself dissolves, replaced by a sense of companionship with your own deeper intelligence. And in that companionship, the path reveals itself step by step, not as a rigid destiny, but as a living dialogue between you and the field that has always been listening. What has been opened through recognition and stabilized through the nocturnal gate now requires articulation at a deeper structural level, because Chapter 3 is not about belief or metaphor alone, but about the architecture through which remembrance occurs, the subtle framework that allows the quantum higher self to interface with the biological mind without distortion. And this framework has been hinted at for millennia through sacred geometry, Hermetic law, and initiatory language, while modern physics approaches it through equations describing vacuum fluctuations, non-locality, and observer participation. And though the languages differ, the underlying intuition is the same. Consciousness does not arise from matter alone, but co-arises with the field that gives matter its form. And when the mind becomes coherent enough, it can sense and interact with this field in ways that feel like remembering rather than learning, because what is accessed is not new information, but latent knowledge already embedded within awareness itself. Zero-point field coupling describes the moment when the constant background energy of the vacuum, once dismissed as theoretical noise, becomes experientially relevant, not as raw power but as informational potential. And in human terms, this manifests as a state in which thoughts feel less self-generated and more received, less effortful and more aligned. And neuroscience offers a parallel description when it observes that during deep coherent states, neural firing becomes globally synchronized, reducing entropy and allowing weak signals to propagate across the brain without being drowned out by noise. And this is critical, because the higher self communicates through subtle signals, intuitive nudges, and pattern recognition, not through loud emotional charge. And without coherence, these signals are easily overridden by habitual thinking, trauma loops, and social conditioning. The emerald tablets encoded this principle symbolically through the idea of the word, the vibration that brings worlds into being. And when Thoth described mastering the voice and silence, he was pointing toward the same requirement modern science identifies, signal-to-noise ratio, because creation does not occur through sheer intensity but through precision, and precision emerges when the mind rests in stillness without collapsing into unconsciousness, a state perfectly mirrored by Theta dominant awareness, where the mind is quiet enough to listen yet awake enough to register nuance. And this is why Sophia's emerald frequency functions as a stabilizing bandwidth, maintaining balance so that coupling occurs without overwhelming the nervous system. In this chapter, the concept of many worlds theory gains experiential relevance, because when consciousness is understood as a selecting function rather than a passive observer, reality appears not as a single predetermined line, but as a branching structure of probabilities, and the higher self operates from a vantage point that perceives these branches simultaneously, not in detail but in pattern, sensing which trajectories lead toward integration and which toward fragmentation. And when zero-point field coupling stabilizes, this pattern sensing becomes accessible to waking awareness as intuition, foresight, and a subtle sense of timing, the feeling of knowing when to act and when to wait without needing justification. And this is not supernatural foresight, but probabilistic sensitivity, an attunement to emerging futures rather than fixed outcomes. Protection, in this context, becomes synonymous with coherence preservation, because timeline errors occur not through external attack, but through internal incoherence. Moments when fear, compulsion, or unconscious patterning pulls attention into low coherent states that amplify chaos, and the higher self's role is not to prevent all hardship, but to maintain learning-rich trajectories, ensuring that challenges contribute to integration rather than disintegration. And Sophia's wisdom ensures that this guidance is compassionate rather than authoritarian, adapting to the individual's capacity and context rather than imposing an idealized path. As coupling deepens, the sense of identity begins to reorganize, not by erasing personality, but by placing it within a wider frame. And this can feel at first like spaciousness, as though the mind has more room to breathe, followed by a gentle detachment from compulsive narratives, and this detachment is often misinterpreted as loss of motivation, but in truth it is the shedding of false urgency, making space for intention that arises from alignment rather than anxiety. And this is where manifestation accelerates, not because of magical thinking, but because action becomes congruent, energy expenditure decreases, and feedback loops tighten, allowing cause and effect to align more cleanly. The architecture of remembrance also involves the body, a fact often overlooked by those who seek transcendence alone, because the nervous system is the interface through which higher states must express, and if it is overloaded or dysregulated, coupling becomes unstable, and this is why ancient initiations emphasized breath, posture, and ritual, while modern neuroscience emphasizes vagal tone, interoception, and embodied awareness, all pointing toward the same truth. The body is not an obstacle to awakening, but its instrument. And Sophia's feminine wisdom honors this by guiding awareness into the heart, the gut, and the subtle sensations that anchor expanded consciousness into lived reality. Dreams and waking intuition now begin to merge, not by eliminating the distinction, but by creating continuity, and symbols encountered at night may echo in daytime events, conversations, or inner reflections, creating a sense of dialogue with reality itself. And this is the hallmark of zero-point field coupling stabilized. The world feels responsive, not in an egocentric way, but in a participatory way, as though consciousness and environment are engaged in a mutual dance of feedback and adjustment. And this can feel both humbling and empowering, dissolving the illusion of isolation while affirming agency. Thoth's teachings on immortality and ascent find new meaning here, because immortality does not imply endless personal survival, but continuity of consciousness across forms. The recognition that awareness is not confined to a single narrative or lifetime, and when this recognition dawns, fear of annihilation softens, replaced by curiosity and responsibility, because if consciousness persists as pattern rather than persona, then choices matter not because of reward or punishment, but because they shape the quality of pattern that continues. And Sophia's wisdom ensures that this realization deepens compassion rather than detachment, connecting personal awakening to collective coherence. As Chapter 3 integrates, you may notice that effort decreases while clarity increases, that decisions feel simpler even when circumstances are complex, and that the need to convince others fades, replaced by quiet embodiment. And this is the sign that remembrance is occurring, not as memory retrieval but as structural alignment. And the emerald signal continues to pulse not as a dramatic event, but as a steady current, supporting the ongoing dialogue between your waking mind and your quantum higher self, a dialogue that will deepen further as the architecture stabilizes and prepares for the next phase of integration, where recognition becomes expression and wisdom seeks form in action. Now here's the question for you. What part of the country are you watching this story from? Drop your state in the comments below.